Imagine reaching a level of fame where your face isn't just on TV, it's the landscape. In 2021, Kris wasn't just a person. He was a walking conglomerate. He was the face of Louis Vuitton, Bulgari, and Porsche. His influence was so massive that if he wore a certain hat, it would sell out globally in minutes. We're talking about an individual with a brand value well over $100 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than the cost of a high-end luxury hotel in Manhattan, built from the ground up. He had it all: the talent, the looks, and a shield of power that seemed impenetrable. But here's the thing about power. It creates a massive blind spot. And for Kris, that blind spot was a young woman named Du Maiju. The fall didn't happen with a bang. It started with a whisper on social media. Du Maiju, who was only 18 at the time, posted a series of allegations that didn't just scratch the surface of his reputation. They shattered it. She described a pattern of behavior that sounded less like a celebrity lifestyle and more like a calculated hunting ground. This wasn't about rock star partying. This was about something much more clinical and predatory. Think about the psychological setup here. Imagine you're a young woman, maybe an aspiring actress or a student. You get a message from the team of the biggest star in the country. They want to interview you for a music video. They tell you it's a career-making opportunity. They invite you to a private residence because, obviously, a superstar can't just walk into a local coffee shop. You walk through those doors thinking your life is about to change for the better. You're nervous, you're excited, and you're looking for a sign that you've finally made it. But once those doors closed, the script changed. There were no cameras. There were no scripts to read. Instead, there was a high-pressure environment where refusing a drink was seen as an insult to the host. According to the accounts that eventually surfaced, these girls were encouraged, or pressured, into drinking until their perception of reality began to blur. This is where the casting ruse becomes a trap. It's a classic power move. Use the promise of a dream to lead someone into a room where they have no defense. When Du Maiju first went public, Kris's team did what every powerful entity does. They tried to bury it. They didn't just deny it. They went on the offensive. They claimed she was a liar, someone looking for a payday. And for a second, it looked like it might work. In the world of high-stakes PR, the person with the most money usually wins the narrative. But Kris made a fatal mistake. He assumed that money could fix a problem that was already bleeding into the public consciousness. He allegedly tried to send a settlement, a large sum of money, to keep her quiet. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. But instead of the money ending the story, it became the evidence that started a fire. Du Maiju didn't take the deal. Instead, she did something that no one in Kris's inner circle expected. She shared the details of these financial negotiations, and then she dropped a bombshell that would change the legal landscape of the entertainment industry forever. She didn't just talk about herself anymore. She hinted at other individuals involved, younger individuals. And she issued an ultimatum that sounded more like a final warning. She gave Kris 24 hours to leave the industry and apologize, or she would release the proof that would ensure he'd never see his life the same way again. At that moment, the $100 million man was sitting in his luxury penthouse, likely thinking this was just another fire his lawyers could put out. He didn't realize that the authorities weren't just watching the posts. They were already tracking the digital fingerprints of a transaction that was never supposed to exist. And as the clock ticked down on that ultimatum, a very specific piece of evidence was being handed over, something much more damning than a social media post. something that involved a paper trail that led straight back to his front door. The paper trail wasn't just a list of bank statements. It was a psychological map of how power operates when it thinks it's untouchable. When the public first saw the allegations, it looked like a messy social media feud. But behind the scenes, there was a series of bank transfers totaling 500,000 ERMB. To put that in perspective, that's about 70,000 US dollars. For most people, that's several years of hard work. For a superstar of his caliber, that was pocket change. Literally the price of a luxury watch he might wear once and then toss in a drawer. The money was supposed to be the off switch. It was intended to buy silence, packaged as a settlement for emotional distress. But here's where the architect of this lie made a fatal mistake. He treated people like line items on a balance sheet. He assumed that everyone had a price, and that once the digital transaction cleared, the memory of the incident would simply evaporate. He didn't account for the fact that a digital footprint is permanent, and a person's dignity isn't always for sale. The auditions were the centerpiece of the whole operation. It was a brilliant, albeit predatory, system. Think about it from the perspective of a 20-year-old girl. You're an aspiring actress or a student, and you get a call from a high-level assistant. They tell you that one of the biggest names in the industry is casting for a new music video. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. When they tell you the meeting is at a private residence at 10 p.m. because he's too famous to go to a public office, you don't see a red flag. You see a VIP pass. You think the fame is your protection. You think someone this famous wouldn't risk everything by doing something wrong. But the environment was carefully engineered to strip away that agency. Once you walked through those doors, the rules changed. Your phone was often taken away for privacy reasons. There was always plenty of alcohol, and the pressure to be social was immense. It wasn't a business meeting. It was a trap designed to isolate. The individual responsible used his status as a shield, creating a scenario where the victims felt that if they spoke up, nobody would believe them over a national icon. The psychology here is fascinating and chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of logistics. He used his professional team to scout, his private residence to isolate, and his massive wealth to clean up the aftermath. It worked for years. It worked so well that he became overconfident. He started believing his own hype, that he was the one in control of the narrative. However, as the authorities began digging into the digital logs of these casting sessions from late 2020, they found a pattern that money couldn't explain away. They found 3 specific women who all described the exact same sequence of events: the invitation, the drinks, the loss of consciousness, and the realization that they had been violated while unable to resist. But as the investigators peeled back the layers of the 2020 incidents, they stumbled upon something even more disturbing. It turned out that the casting sessions weren't the only way he operated. There was a darker, more organized event from 2018 that hadn't been whispered about in any of the Weibo posts. It involved a group setting, a complete lack of consent, and a level of coordination that suggested this wasn't just one man's bad behavior. It was a lifestyle. And the silent witness to that night wasn't a person at all. It was a piece of data that had been sitting on a server for 3 years, waiting for someone to finally look at it. If the 2020 allegations were the spark, this 2018 discovery was the gasoline that was about to turn a scandal into a life sentence in any of the Weibo posts. It involved a group setting, a complete lack of consent, and a level of coordination that suggested this wasn't just one man's bad behavior. It was a lifestyle. And the silent witness to that night wasn't a person at all. It was a piece of data that had been sitting on a server for 3 years, waiting for someone to finally look at it. If the 2020 allegations were the spark, this 2018 discovery was the gasoline that was about to turn a scandal into a life sentence. The post that changed everything wasn't a polished press release or a formal police statement. It was a series of raw, desperate screenshots. On July 8, 2021, a 19-year-old student named Du Meiju decided she had enough of the silence. She didn't just whisper into the void. She screamed into the megaphone of the internet. Think about the guts that takes. On one side, you have a man who was the face of global luxury brands, his image plastered on skyscrapers from Shanghai to Paris. On the other side, a teenager with a smartphone and a story that seemed impossible to prove. But Du Meiju had something his PR team didn't expect: a digital trail. She began detailing a casting process that sounded more like a strategic operation than a talent search. It wasn't happening in a high-rise office with agents and lawyers. It was happening in living rooms and private villas. The bait was always the same: a chance to be in a music video, an opportunity of a lifetime. For a young woman trying to make it in a competitive world, that's not just a job offer, it's a golden ticket. The psychological hook here is brilliant and devastating. When a superstar invites you to an interview, your guard is already down. You trust the fame. You trust the system that put him there. Du Meiju described being pressured to drink until the room started spinning, until her ability to say no was physically stripped away. When she woke up the next morning, the superstar wasn't a hero anymore. He was a person who had crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. The scale of his influence is hard to wrap your head around unless you look at the numbers. We're talking about someone with over 50 million followers on Weibo. To put that in perspective, that's more people than the entire population of Spain or South Korea. When he posted, the world watched. So, when Du Meiju's allegations went viral, the momentum was like a tidal wave. Within days, other women started coming forward. The silent witnesses weren't silent anymore. They were in her DMs, telling the exact same story. The same drinks, the same house, the same feeling of being trapped. But here is where the story takes a sharp, dark turn into criminal psychology. Predators who operate at this level often believe their wealth makes them invincible. They think every problem has a price tag. And soon, money began to move. We're talking about a transfer of 500,000 yuan, roughly $77,000. In a world where a young student might struggle to pay rent, that is a life-altering amount of money. It was framed as a settlement, but in the eyes of the law, it looked a lot more like an attempt to buy a person's memory. What Kris Wu's team didn't realize was that the authorities were now looking at more than just a social media feud. They were looking at the 2018 data. They found evidence of an incident involving 3 different women who were violated in a group setting while they were incapacitated. This wasn't a he said, she said situation. This was a pattern of behavior that suggested a systemic hunt. As the public waited for a confession or a denial, a new character stepped out of the shadows. A mysterious negotiator appeared, claiming to represent the victims. But this person wasn't looking for justice. They were playing a much more dangerous game of high-stakes extortion. The police began to realize that while the superstar was the center of the scandal, there was a third party pulling strings that could destroy everyone involved. And the most shocking part, this person wasn't who they claimed to be, and their meddling was about to hand the police the one piece of evidence they needed to make an arrest. This person wasn't who they claimed to be, and their meddling was about to hand the police the one piece of evidence they needed to make an arrest. His name was Lu, a 23-year-old high school dropout who spent his days looking for an angle. He wasn't a lawyer, and he certainly wasn't a victim's advocate. He was a ghost in the machine. He saw the public feud between the superstar and the young influencer, and he saw a chance to make a life-changing amount of money. Liu started playing a double game that was as bold as it was stupid. He contacted the superstar's team pretending to be the influencer's representative, demanding a massive settlement. Then he turned around and contacted the influencer, pretending to be the superstar's lawyer, offering a deal to buy her silence. He was asking for 3 million yuan. To put that in perspective, that's about $460,000. In many parts of the world, that's a nice house paid for in cash. But in this world, it was just the price of a hush money transaction. Liu was so confident he could outsmart everyone that he didn't realize he was creating a digital map right to his doorstep. While the superstar's legal team thought they were negotiating with a victim, they were actually being played by a guy in a cramped apartment. But while this sideshow of extortion was playing out, the real horror of the audition trap was coming into focus. You have to understand how this worked. It wasn't like a movie scene where someone is grabbed off the street. It was much more calculated, much more professional. It started with a simple text or a message on social media from someone claiming to be an assistant or a casting director. They would tell these young women, some as young as 17 or 18, that they were being considered for a lead role in a new music video or a major fashion campaign. Imagine being that age, standing in front of your mirror, practicing your lines, thinking your life is about to change. You're told the meeting is at a private residence because the star needs privacy from the paparazzi. You show up, and it's a beautiful, high-end apartment. There's music, there's expensive food, and there are plenty of drinks. The psychological pressure is immense. If you don't drink, you're labeled as difficult. If you try to leave, you're told you're being unprofessional and ruining your one big shot. You're told that this is just how the industry works behind the scenes. One specific detail that investigators later focused on was the presence of gatekeepers. These weren't just friends. They were people whose job it was to make sure the alcohol kept flowing and the phones stayed out of sight. It was an environment designed to strip away your defenses. The police started looking at the timing of these auditions. They weren't held during business hours. They happened late at night, often ending in the early morning hours. They found a pattern. The superstar used his status as a shining light in the industry to create a power imbalance that was impossible for a teenager to fight. It was a classic predatory architecture. You build a room where the door only opens one way, and once that door closed, the casting call became a scene of violation. The victims described a feeling of being trapped in a dream that quickly turned into a nightmare. They were in a state where they couldn't give consent, or were pressured so heavily that the word no felt like it would end their dreams forever. As the police dug deeper into the superstar's digital history, they found something Liu, the extortionist, had accidentally highlighted. By trying to sell evidence to both sides, Liu had forced the superstar's team to archive their own communications to use as proof against him. They were keeping records to protect themselves from a scammer, not realizing those records contained the very proof the police needed to confirm the audition trap was real. The superstar thought his money could buy a way out of any mess. He thought a few $100,000 would make the incidents disappear. But the paper trail was already glowing red. And just as the superstar thought he had finally handled the problem with a secret payment, the police knocked on his door. They didn't want to talk about extortion. They wanted to talk about what happened after the cameras were turned off and the drinks were poured. And they had a witness who was about to turn the superstar's world upside down. Imagine feeling like the world is your personal playground. When you're at that level of fame, you start to believe your own hype. You think the rules are for the people in the nosebleed seats, not the guy on stage. For Kris, that sense of security wasn't just a feeling. It was a fortress built on money and influence. He figured a payment of 500,000 yuan, $77,000, or the price of a brand new high-end Tesla, would be enough to buy silence. To a normal person, that's a life-changing sum. To him, it was just the cost of doing business. But here's where the fluid evidence comes in. And I'm not talking about anything biological. I'm talking about the way the story started to leak through the cracks of his carefully constructed image. The primary fluid in this case was the alcohol. It was the tool of choice. In late 2020, 3 women were invited to his home under the guise of a professional meeting. Think about that for a second. You're an aspiring actress or a student, and one of the biggest stars on the planet invites you over to talk career. You don't say no. You show up with a resume and a dream, but you're met with a glass of something strong. The investigation began to reveal a pattern that looked less like a party and more like a tactical operation. The silent witnesses weren't just the victims themselves, but the digital breadcrumbs they left behind. Texts that said, "I don't feel well," or "Where am I?" Messages sent to friends in a haze of confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a script he'd written and performed many times before. He'd use his staff to coordinate these interviews, creating a layer of professional legitimacy that made the victims feel safe, until the door clicked shut. While Kris was busy playing the victim of an extortion plot on social media, claiming he'd never even met some of these people, the facts were telling a different story. Investigators weren't just looking at bank transfers. They were looking at the psychology of the trap. They found that the alcohol wasn't just there for fun. It was used to ensure the victims reached a state where they couldn't possibly defend themselves. In the eyes of the law, that's the definition of a violation. Kris sat in his luxury apartment, probably checking his follower count, convinced that his team of lawyers and his massive PR machine would bury this. He was operating on an old-school playbook: silence the accuser, smear their reputation, and wait for the news cycle to move on. He didn't realize that the cultural landscape had shifted. The public wasn't just looking for gossip anymore. They were looking for accountability. The false security he felt was his undoing. He was so confident that he actually welcomed the police involvement initially, thinking they'd arrest his accusers for trying to take his money. He handed over his phone. He opened his doors. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room. But as the detectives scrolled through the data, they didn't find a victim of a scam. They found a digital map of a predator's territory. And then, something surfaced that changed everything. It wasn't a text from 2021. It went back even further, to 2018. A specific incident involving multiple people that suggested this wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a lifestyle. The police realized they weren't just looking at one incident. They were looking at a systemic abuse of power that had been going on for years. The superstar's smile began to fade when he realized the questions weren't about the money anymore. They were about the women who couldn't remember how they got home. They were about the casting calls that never resulted in a single role. And as the sun began to set on his career, the police revealed they had one piece of evidence he never saw coming. A piece of evidence that proved he wasn't just a bystander in those rooms. They had a testimony that didn't just describe a crime, it described a predatory system. And that witness? They weren't just anyone. They were someone from inside his inner circle. ready to break the silence. The inner circle witness didn't just point fingers. They handed over a roadmap of how a superstar's team handles problems. We're talking about a well-oiled machine designed to make the messy parts of a celebrity's life vanish into thin air. One of the most chilling details to emerge was the sheer business-like nature of it all. This wasn't just a guy making bad choices. It was a corporate strategy for silence. Imagine being 19 years old, standing in a room with a legal team that earns more in an hour than your family makes in a year. They aren't there to comfort you. They are there to present you with a choice. On one side, there's a non-disclosure agreement, a stack of papers thick enough to stop a bullet, and a check. On the other side, there's the threat of a defamation lawsuit that would bury you in debt for the rest of your life. The numbers involved here tell the real story. During the investigation, records surfaced of a 500,000 yuan settlement offer. To put that in perspective, 500,000 yuan is roughly 70,000 US dollars. In the world of high-fashion ambassadors and stadium tours, that's pocket change. The cost of a single luxury watch or a first-class trip to Paris. But for a young student or an aspiring influencer, that amount of money represents 5 to 6 years of a median salary in a major city like Beijing. It's enough to buy a small apartment in a hometown or pay for a decade of tuition. It's a life-changing amount of money used to ensure that a life-changing trauma never sees the light of day. But the price of silence wasn't just about the cash. It was about the psychological golden cage. When the witness from the inner circle described a system where victims were often contacted under the guise of career advancement. It was a casting call or a music video audition. When the incident occurred, the power dynamic was already skewed. The victim felt that if they spoke up, they weren't just accusing a man, they were destroying their own dreams. The team would remind them how many people's jobs depended on this star's reputation. They made the victims feel like the ones who were doing something wrong by being there in the first place. This is where the silent witness comes in, a simple bank transfer receipt. To a casual observer, it looks like a routine transaction. To investigators, it was a fingerprint of a cover-up. Why would a global icon be sending large sums of money to a teenager he supposedly barely knew? The paper trail didn't match the public narrative of just a misunderstanding. It looked like a payout. The psychology here is predatory in its most clinical form. By turning a violation into a transaction, the perpetrator attempts to reclaim control. If you take the money, you've sold your right to the truth. If you don't, you're difficult or clout chasing. It's a trap designed to leave no exits. As the police dug deeper into these financial records and the testimonies of those who worked behind the scenes, they realized this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a pattern that stretched back years, involving more than just the 2020 Bielst-Ama incidents that sparked the initial firestorm. They found evidence of similar arrangements dating back to 2018, suggesting that this predatory system had been functioning without a hitch for a long time. But as the investigators began to connect the dots between the money, the NDAs, and the ruined lives, they stumbled upon something that changed the entire scope of the case. They realized that Kris Wu wasn't just acting alone, and he wasn't just doing this in China. The price of silence had been paid in more than one country. And some of those payments were starting to bounce. The police were about to uncover a specific piece of digital evidence, a deleted group chat, that didn't just prove he was in the room. It proved he was the architect of a game where the players had no idea they were even playing. And the rules of that game were about to be read aloud in a court of law. The rules of that game were about to be read aloud in a court of law. But before the first gavel even hit the wood, the corporate world had already delivered its own verdict. The deleted group chat wasn't just a digital paper trail, it was a blueprint. It revealed that what the public saw as organic meetups were actually curated sessions. Imagine a system so efficient, it felt like a Fortune 500 company. But instead of selling software, it was sourcing young women under false pretenses. When the news broke that the police weren't just looking into things, but had actually taken him into custody, the industry experienced a collective heart attack. This wasn't a slow burn. It was a 24-hour fire sale of a human brand. Within a single day, 15 major global brands, from luxury fashion houses in Paris to snack companies in Beijing, erased him from existence. They didn't just stop the ads. They wiped their servers. It was as if he never existed. To put that into perspective, the estimated loss in endorsement value alone was over $150 million. That's not just rich person money. That is the equivalent of the entire annual GDP of a small island nation, vanished in a single afternoon. If you were walking through a high-end mall that morning, his face was on every billboard. By that evening, staff were literally scraping his decals off the glass with razor blades. But while the brands were scrubbing the surface, the investigators were digging into the silent witnesses. They found records of payments, settlements disguised as gifts or career support. This is where the psychology of power gets dark. When you have that much influence, you don't think you're breaking the rules. You think you're just managing expenses. He viewed these individuals not as people with rights, but as variables in a very expensive game. The game was simple, but devastating. Use the promise of a music video or a career-making role to bring them to a private residence. Once the doors were shut, the power dynamic shifted. The alcohol served wasn't for a celebration. It was a tool to ensure a lack of resistance. One specific detail haunted the investigators: a phone left in a bowl of rice to dry, supposedly after being accidentally dropped in a drink. It wasn't an accident. It was a tactical move to ensure the individual couldn't call for a ride home or record what was happening. To a forensic team, that phone is more than electronics. It's a piece of evidence showing premeditation. The legal system in this case didn't move with the typical slow crawl. As the evidence from those deleted chats was reconstructed, a horrifying pattern emerged. It wasn't just one incident in 2021. The digital breadcrumbs led back to 2018. It involved multiple people who had been terrified into silence because they were told no one would believe a fan over a superstar. They were told their lives would be ruined if they spoke up. But the biggest shock wasn't just the prison time. It was the specific wording of the judgment that came down in November 2022. 13 years. That's more than a decade of his life gone. But it was the additional part of the sentence that sent a shiver through the industry. Because even after those 13 years are served, the story doesn't just end with a release. There was a detail in the sentencing, a specific legal clause, that meant Kris Wu would never be allowed to set foot on that soil again. But before he could even process the idea of being a man without a country, a new set of rumors began to leak from behind the prison walls. Rumors that suggested his global superstar status was earning him a very different kind of attention from the other residents in his cell block. And then, there was the matter of the chemical rumors, a terrifying possibility that suggested his punishment wouldn't just be about time, but about his very biology, ever be allowed to set foot on that soil again. But before he could even process the idea of being a man without a country, a new set of rumors began to leak from behind the prison walls. Rumors that suggested his global superstar status was earning him a very different kind of attention from the other residents in his cell block. And then, there was the matter of the chemical rumors, a terrifying possibility that suggested his punishment wouldn't just be about time, but about his very biology. In Canada, the legal system has a very specific, often debated way of dealing with individuals. Convicted of the types of violations Kris was facing, it involves a medical intervention designed to chemically suppress certain hormones to prevent reoffending. While it's not an automatic part of every sentence, the mere mention of it in relation to his eventual deportation sent shockwaves through his remaining fan base. The thought was haunting. He wasn't just losing his career, he was potentially losing control over his own body. On November 25th, 2022, the reality of his situation was carved into stone. A court in Beijing handed down the verdict: 13 years. To understand the weight of that number, you have to look at it through a human lens. 13 years is enough time for a toddler to grow into a teenager. It's 4,745 days of waking up in a room where you don't own the key. For a man who was used to private jets and five-star suites, the transition wasn't just a change in lifestyle. It was a total psychological collapse. The breakdown of the sentence was clinical. 11 years and 6 months were for the primary incidents involving 3 women who were unable to protect themselves due to intoxication. Another year and 10 months were added for a 2018 incident categorized as group activities. Yet this wasn't just a slap on the wrist to satisfy the public. This was a systematic dismantling of his life. But there was a second part to that verdict that hit just as hard. The court ordered his immediate deportation upon the completion of his sentence. This is a rare and devastating blow for someone with his level of fame. It means he will serve over a decade in a Chinese facility, and the very second he is released, he will be escorted to an airport and permanently barred from the country that made him a billionaire. He is, for all intents and purposes, a man whose future has been erased from the map of his home. While he sat in detention, the financial empire he'd built was also being liquidated. The tax authorities didn't just look at his income, they looked at the shadows. They discovered a massive web of tax evasion, slapping him with a fine of 600 million yuan. That's roughly $84 million. To put that in perspective, that's more money than most people will see in 1,000 lifetimes, gone in a single legal filing. He went from being a luxury brand's greatest asset to a massive liability that the state was now collecting on. The psychological shift here is what's truly chilling. During the trial, Kris reportedly maintained a sense of disbelief. He had spent years being told yes by everyone around him. In his mind, he was the protagonist of a movie that couldn't possibly end in a jail cell. But the evidence, the text messages, the bank transfers used to try and quiet the victims, the testimony from those who saw the casting calls for what they really were, it was all too heavy. He tried to fight. He filed an appeal in 2023, likely hoping that his former status or some technicality would save him. He sat in that cell for months, waiting for a different answer. But in November of that year, the High Court delivered the final blow. The appeal was rejected. The sentence stood. The story should have ended there. A fallen idol, a decade of silence, and an eventual flight to a country that might have its own medical punishments waiting for him. But as investigators began closing the books on Kris Wu, they stumbled upon a series of encrypted messages on a secondary device. These weren't messages from Kris. They were messages about him, sent by high-level executives in the entertainment industry, suggesting that the casting system he used wasn't just his own invention. It was a blueprint used by others who are still out there, watching the headlines and wondering if their names are next. As investigators began closing the books on Kris Wu, they stumbled upon a series of encrypted messages on a secondary device. These weren't messages from Kris. They were messages about him, sent by high-level executives in the entertainment industry, suggesting that the casting system he used wasn't just his own invention. It was a blueprint used by others who are still out there, watching the headlines and wondering if their names are next. This discovery shifted the entire perspective of the case. We weren't just looking at one man's bad behavior anymore. We were looking at a ghost network. Think of it like an elaborate, high-stakes theater production, where the star is the only one who doesn't realize the stagehands are actually hunters. This secondary device, a sleek, unremarkable smartphone found tucked away in a velvet-lined drawer, contained a digital paper trail of how a superstar is maintained. The messages revealed a cold, calculated recruitment process. It didn't start with Kris. It started with assistants, talent scouts, and friends who functioned more like procurement officers. They would scout social media for girls who fit a very specific aesthetic, usually young, often from smaller cities, and possessing what the industry calls a first love face. To these girls, a message from an associate of a global icon wasn't a warning sign, it was a lottery ticket. It was the promise of a life that looks like a perfume commercial. But the psychology of the ghost network is where things get truly dark. You have to ask, why would these enablers, many of whom were women themselves, participate in this? The answer lies in the golden goose syndrome. In the high-pressure world of C-pop and global endorsements, a star like Kris Wu represents a revenue stream worth more than $20 million a year. To put that in perspective, that's like a small, highly profitable tech company walking around in a designer suit. If the golden goose wants a party, the network makes sure the party happens. If the golden goose gets messy, the network cleans it up. The messages on that phone talked about filtering the girls. They discussed who was compliant and who might be trouble. It was a grading system for human beings. When we look at the psychological profile of this network, we see a terrifying lack of empathy. To them, these young women weren't people. They were logistics. They were items on a checklist to keep the talent happy so the contracts would keep getting signed. The investigation found that this blueprint was terrifyingly efficient. It relied on the silent witness of NDA agreements and the massive power imbalance of the industry. If a girl felt something was wrong, she was reminded, either subtly or overtly, that she was one person against a billion-dollar machine. The cost of speaking up wasn't just a lost job. It was the total erasure of her reputation. As the authorities dug deeper into the ghost network, they realized that Kris Wu might have been the face of the scandal, but he was also a product of this very system. He had been told yes for so long by so many people whose paychecks depended on his happiness that he likely believed he was untouchable. He was living in a reality where the rules of the outside world simply didn't apply. But the most chilling part of the encrypted messages wasn't what was said about the past. It was what they hinted at for the future. The logs showed that this wasn't an isolated incident. There were references to the usual arrangement and the standard setup. It implies a recurring script. And while Kris was behind bars, the people who wrote that script, the ones who scouted the targets and poured the drinks, were still operating in the shadows. The investigators realized they were looking at a house of cards, and Kris Wu was just the one at the very top. As they scrolled through the final threads of the encrypted chat, they found a message sent just days before the first public accusation. It wasn't about Kris. It mentioned another name, another high-profile individual who had requested the same casting services for an upcoming project. The police realized then that the ghost network didn't live or die with one star. It was a parasitic entity that just moved on to the next host. And as they cross-referenced the names in those chats with active production schedules, they found something that made their blood run cold. One of the names mentioned as a facilitator in the Kris Wu case had just been hired to manage the world tour of an even bigger celebrity. The blueprint was already being rolled out again, and the next set of interviews was scheduled to begin in less than 48 hours. That 48-hour window wasn't just a deadline, it was a race. While the public was focused on the fall of one man, the machinery that built him was already pivot-shifting. It's the ultimate loophole in the entertainment industry. The individual is replaceable, but the system is permanent. This case wasn't just about a celebrity who crossed a line. It was about the infrastructure that allowed that line to be erased entirely. Think about the psychology for a second. We're talking about someone who was at the absolute top of the food chain. When you're at that level, the line between fan and target starts to blur. To him, the world wasn't a collection of people with lives and feelings. It was a menu. Those casting calls at his private residence weren't lapses in judgment. They were a calculated method. By bringing these young women into a domestic space under the guise of career advancement, he removed the professional barriers that usually protect people. It's a classic power play. You take someone's biggest dreams, the dream of being a star, of being seen, and you use those dreams as a leash. And let's look at the money. We aren't just talking about pocket change. The financial records uncovered during the investigation showed transfers that were astronomical. These were payments of tens of thousands of dollars, amounts that could pay off a family's debt or buy a house in some parts of the world, sent over in an instant just to ensure a quiet resolution. These weren't gifts of generosity. They were settlements masquerading as kindness. It's a specialized kind of psychological warfare, turning a violation into a transaction so the victim feels like they've somehow participated in their own misfortune. It's designed to make them feel like they can't speak up because they took the money. But the digital age, the very thing that built his massive platform, ended up being the thing that tore it down. Every text, every deleted Weibo thread, every digital footprint left behind became a silent witness. Before the internet, a story like this might have stayed behind a locked door or been buried by a high-priced PR firm. In 2021, the landscape had changed. A single post from Du Meiju acted like a crack in a massive dam. Once that first leak started, the pressure of 1,000 other stories became too much for the dam to hold. The final sentence handed down was as 13 years. To put that into perspective, 13 years is longer than the entire time he spent in the limelight. It's a lifetime in the world of pop culture. By the time he finishes that term and faces deportation, the world will have completely moved on. He will be a ghost in a culture that moves at the speed of light. The superstar version of him is already gone, replaced by a case file and a cautionary tale. But here's the part that should really stay with you. The facilitators, the people who organized the schedules, the ones who poured the drinks, the ones who made sure the doors were locked and the phones were confiscated. Most of them are still out there. They didn't go to prison. They didn't lose their careers. They just updated their resumes and moved to the next office. As you're hearing this, someone is likely walking into a private interview for a major opportunity in a penthouse or a studio somewhere. They're being told that this is just how the business works. They're being told that they're the lucky ones. The blueprint wasn't destroyed when this case closed. It was just archived, waiting for the next person with enough power to think they're untouchable. The tragedy didn't end with a court ruling. The most dangerous thing about this story isn't what happened in that house in Beijing. It's how easily it could be happening again tonight, in any city, under a different name, while the world watches a different screen. The digital warning is out there, but the question is, are we actually looking at the signs, or are we just waiting for the next star to fall?